Hello and welcome to Model Kit Stuff, and welcome to another introducing basics video. And today I want to just very briefly talk about thinning paint, because it's one of the most basic skills you can learn, and until you've got it right, you're going to have all sorts of problems. It doesn't matter how well you've built your model. If you don't get the painting right, that's the finish. That's what everyone sees. And also, if you're moving from brush painting over to airbrushing, then thinning your paint becomes even more critical. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you my basic approach to thinning paint, and by the end of the video, anybody, even if you've never done modeling before, should be able to understand the basic principle of how to thin paint and get it thin enough for your airbrush and for brush painting. So if you're a brush painter and you have issues with brush marks being left in your paint finish, if you have issues of patchy shininess in your paint finish when it's a matte paint, for example, or you have problems sometimes with splatter or getting the paint to flow through your airbrush, or you've got paint pooling around detail where you can see that there is thicker paint around the detail than there is over the rest of the area you're covering. It's likely that all of those issues that I've just mentioned are due to not thinning the paint correctly. If you over thin it, that can give you problems. If you under thin it, that can give you problems. So let's start with a couple of things that you might typically hear modelers talking about when thinning paint. Firstly, there are quite a few experienced modelers out there that will talk about ratios, and that can be quite scary if you're new to the hobby. The thing about ratios is some paint systems have ratios that are known and genuinely work, but there are caveats to all of them, and for me that means that they don't really work. So for example, Tamiya paint, the rule of thumb is when you get it, you take the lid off, you fill it up to the base of the neck. So if I take the lid off, up to the base of the neck with the A20 thinner from Tamiya, and that's about the right ratio for thinning your paint. But thinning your paint for what? Same with model colour. The ratio for thinning model colour, as a rule, is 50-50. 50% paint, 50% something else, and I have done a video on that. But again, it depends on what you're using it for. The problem with the ratios is that they're great if you're airbrushing perhaps, but they might not work when you're painting. They might not work when you want different thicknesses of paint on your dioramas, possibly. They also don't allow for the fact that some paints get thicker as they get older. Some paints, if they've already been thinned, you might need to thin again. So as a rule, they're okay, but it's not a perfect solution. And certainly there isn't ratios for all paint systems. Some paint systems have different viscosities of paint, thickness of paint, depending on the colour. So you can't have a rule for that. So when you've not got a rule, how do you get to a point where you know you've thinned your paint correctly? Well, you start with understanding the thickness of the paint you've got. So I'm using this. This is a Vallejo model colour. So a thicker, heavier viscosity than a Model Air paint. And I'm going to start by putting it in a palette here. There you go. So you start with your basic paint, and if I tip this palette on its side, you can see it runs really, really slowly. So that's telling me it is too thick. Now, the other rule that you'll hear modelers talk about is thinning your paint to the consistency of milk. I've never liked that. I really haven't liked that because firstly, there's lots of different consistencies of milk, and it's a little bit abstract for my way of thinking. So I need something that makes a little bit more sense to me. So I use the speed rule. So when I say the speed rule, I mean the speed of the paint, how the paint flows, and that's why I've got it in this palette, because we can demonstrate that. So if I take this brush and I draw my paint up to the edge of the palette there, you'll see it's very, very, very slowly rolling back down into the base of the palette. So you know that that paint is too thick. If you put that on straight away as it is on your model, what you're going to get is you're going to get paint lines. You're also going to use an awful lot of paint to cover anything. You're going to hide detail, and you're going to get probably lots of bubbles and imperfections in your paint. So that is too thick as it is. So we're not going to focus on what you thin your paint with. I would say as a general rule, especially if you're new to the hobby, use the thinner that is designed for the paint system. So today I'll be using Vallejo thinner, and I'll also be using some airbrush flow improver. Despite the fact that it says it's for airbrush, you can also use it for brush painting. What it really does is slow down the drying time of the paint. So on an airbrush, that will help reduce the amount of tip dry you get depending on how long your painting session is. So regardless of whether you're thinning it with a thinner, with water, or however you're going about it, we're going to focus on how do you know the paint's the right viscosity for your job, that you've got the thickness of the paint right and you've thinned it correctly. Well, you start by putting a little bit of thinner in and working it in, and the way to do it is a little bit at a time. So I put about 4 drops in there, and if I wipe my brush on the edge of the palette, you'll see that's moving more quickly. But again, that is still too thick. Let me show you. If I paint with this, looks like you've got good coverage, but actually you can see the brush marks in it, which means it's still too thick. So that's a good way of double checking what you've done. Add a bit more thinner. Make sure that you've mixed it in properly. You will see a change in the colour. Usually, the more thinner you put in, the slightly lighter the colour shade goes. That's now got, I think, 8 drops in. But the number of drops really doesn't matter. What you're now going to do is run your paintbrush on the side of the palette. And that went down a lot quicker. Let me show you again. Yeah. So that could be okay for some painting jobs. So if you're doing terrain on dioramas and you do want it a little bit more saturated, then you might get away with that. But for airbrush, that is still too thick. And for most painting jobs, it's still too thick. There you go. So we're nearly there. So I'm going to add just a little bit more. Now at this point I have to say this really comes with experience, but the way of measuring it is the speed the paint rolls down your palette or the side of your paint cup or whatever you're mixing your paint in. So let's try that now. Now that looks right to me, so there you go. It goes straight back into the paint. It doesn't hang around on the side of the palette, it's straight down. So that is the correct consistency of paint for either brush painting. There you go. See, you can't see through it. Can you see how it's paler again? You can't see through it. It's not leaving any witness. It's settling without leaving any brush strokes. So that's about right for brushing. You could go a bit thinner and do several coats. Some people like to work like that. My general rule is thick, thinner, thinnest when it comes to brush painting, but that will go through your airbrush now, and that's it. That's how you thin paint. It's all to do with the speed and some experience. So I can put that in my airbrush now, and I know and I'm confident that will go through the airbrush without clogging. It's not going to cause me any problems because I've mixed it in a palette. I'm not going to have any issues with chunks of paint that might fall in and block my airbrush, so I'm not creating problems for myself, and I can tell that that paint is ready to go. So there you go. That's my quick rule on thinning paint. It's nothing to be scared of. The best way of understanding how to thin paint is to get stuck in and thin your paints. If you think you've gone too far, you can always add some more paint, but that's it. That's the way to do it. Not the consistency of milk, but speed. How quickly the paint rolls away when you wipe it on the side of your palette, paint cup or whatever. So there you go, that's it. You will learn with experience what works for you as a modeler. All modelers are slightly different. How you want to work with your paint and how you want to apply your paint. Brush, airbrush, you know. You can get away with different paint thicknesses depending on what you're doing and depending on the colour. So there you have it. That's my thoughts and tips on how to thin paint. Hope that was useful. Thanks for looking in. You enjoy your modelling, and I'll see you very soon.